Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are jumping into a really high stakes question. How does your physical environment actually shape your ability to build wealth? Our mission is to cut straight to the core factors that define success in real estate and wealth building, specifically by examining how location, whether you're, surrounded by dense city centers or expansive rural land, dictates not only your investment strategy, but your entire execution framework.
That's absolutely the critical lens for this deep dive. Our sources aren't just offering, simple investment tips. They treat the physical environment itself as a primary economic variable. We are analyzing the forces, things like architectural history, urban planning theory, market mechanics, and even behavioral science that dictate where value is created and opportunities arise across these, hugely diverse landscapes.
Okay, let's establish the ground rules then. What fundamental principles determine value, whether you are analyzing say, a multi-story tower in Manhattan or maybe a 20-acre parcel out in the country ready for a quick flip?
We probably have to start where it all began, the actual structures we live and work in.
Right. When you look at American residential architecture, it's not just a straightforward copy of European styles, is it? It's really an evolution, kind of forced by a whole new continent. American builders had to deal with extreme climates, vast terrain, and a society that was, less rigid than the old world.
Exactly. And that tension between formality and sheer necessity is visible right from the start of the Republic. Take the federal style, for instance,
Yeah.
which dominated between roughly 1780 and 1820, or the neoclassical styles. They were heavily influenced by Andrea Palladio, who emphasized classical, very symmetrical forms. Think of Thomas Jefferson's first version of Monticello. That was a direct nod to Palladian principles designed for, grand, orderly presentation.
But American builders never seemed to fully commit to the rigid rules, did they? They took liberties. When you look closely at those federal-style columns, for example, they were often elongated, a practice called attenuation, which departed from the stricter, sort of correct proportions favored by European neoclassicists. Why does this even matter to us today, talking about wealth building?
Well, I think it matters because it shows an early, almost fundamental preference for space, for openness, and adaptation over rigid formality. It's a preference that arguably continues to define suburban appeal, even now.
Ah, okay.
Precisely. That desire for a uniquely American aesthetic and a definite move toward the informal really crystallized with the picturesque movement. This was championed in America by figures like Andrew Jackson Downing in the mid-19th century. Styles like the Italian villa, popular around 1845 to 1870, were actively promoted as valuing irregular designs. Downing basically suggested that symmetry and formality were, boring. Irregularity evokes the beautiful or picturesque, especially when it was blended into a natural rural setting.
So the American dream starts shifting away from the precise, orderly city square and toward the more organic country estate idea. This seems to culminate in the later reminiscent styles from maybe 1880 to 1940, like the shingle and craftsman styles.
Yes, and these were a conscious, almost philosophical reaction against the highly decorated, sometimes cluttered aesthetic of the late Gilded Age. The craftsmen and shingle homes weren't just about architecture. They were linked to a lifestyle, a search for a comfortable, almost spiritual connection to the land, often involving hobbies like gardening and outdoor sports, that sort of thing.
And the materials reflected that choice of environment, right?
Absolutely. In denser suburban settings, you might find smooth, manufactured bricks used for a sense of formality. But when these same styles were built in more rugged, rural, or coastal areas, designers often incorporated rustic stonework for the foundations and lower courses. It creates this sense of being deeply rooted in the natural terrain.
It's pretty clear that American architectural history is, in many ways, the story of moving outward. But if we pivot from that picturesque sort of sprawling country ideal back to the city, the rules completely flip, don't they? The economic and social viability of a city, as Jane Jacobs argued, seems entirely dependent on diversity and density. Hashtag 1.2 urban density and diversity, the city model.
Jacobs' principles for city vitality are just foundational to understanding urban real estate value. It's crucial. If you try to plan a city based only on aesthetics, or worse, segregation, you basically guarantee its failure. True city vitality requires 4 really crucial physical and economic conditions.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you absolutely must have buildings that vary significantly in age and condition. Why? Because that ensures a variation in the required economic yield. A brand new high-rise needs massive rent to justify its cost, obviously. But a century-old 3-story building can survive on lower rents. That ensures essential service providers like, say, a small tailor or a unique bookstore can actually afford to stay in the neighborhood.
Right. That economic stratification keeps things lively and functional. Okay, what are the other three critical factors?
Second, high population density is essential. And importantly, that must include residential density. People have to live there. Third, you need a primary mixture of uses, so dwellings, working places, shops, all jumbled together. This is especially crucial for areas like downtowns where life often just shuts down after 5 p.m. If people don't live there, the streets become empty, and empty streets, well, they tend to feel unsafe.
And if you fall below that threshold of density, even a seemingly well-intentioned area will likely fail in the city environment. Our sources cite that very low densities, specifically something like 6 dwellings or fewer to the net acre, averaging maybe 70 by 100-foot lots, can succeed in suburbs. But that's because suburbs have different rules of community structure and surveillance, right?
Exactly. They rely on totally different mechanisms. In the city, low density fails because city high density requires specific relief mechanisms to stop constructive vitality from just becoming inert and boring. This relief means things like numerous short streets to maximize corner interaction, lively, well-used parks, and the constant mingling of non-residential uses within dwelling areas. If you don't provide that constant interaction, those city spaces just die.
And we should also talk about the inverse of that, the massive single-use structure, this idea of the border vacuum.
Oh, yes. A border vacuum is created by any massive single-purpose entity. Think of a huge university campus or a monolithic convention center or even a massive public housing project that occupies several city blocks with very little interaction on the ground floor. They are terrible neighbors to what Jacobs called ordinary city life because they stop movement and interaction dead right at their perimeters. They don't generate that cross-pollination of people or purposes. It's like a dead zone that just drains life from the surrounding blocks.
You know, I can hear a listener thinking, but wait a minute, isn't the modern concept of a highly secure, single-use tech campus, or maybe a massive data center, succeeding precisely because it stops interaction at its perimeter? Are Jacobs' principles still relevant in the post-industrial city?
That's a fantastic challenge, actually. And I argue that while a secure tech campus might succeed financially for its owners, it's successful despite and often at the expense of its surrounding neighborhood, exactly as Jacobs described. The financial value of the city is shifting, you see. It's not just about real estate appreciation anymore. It's increasingly about network density, the density of high-skilled labor, capital, specialized knowledge. A single-use vacuum, by its nature, stops the flow of that human capital exchange. So the modern city core has to constantly prove its value as a superior exchange hub to survive the kind of exodus enabled by remote work. Hashtag tag 1.3, the legacy of suburbanization and segregation.
That tension between the centralized urban network and the persistent desire for space leads us directly to the historical pattern of suburbanization. And that has profoundly shaped today's wealth landscape, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The pattern is quite clear historically. The middle and upper classes increasingly gravitated toward the urban edges. But crucially, this wasn't just an organic, unassisted move. It was often subsidized. Centralized street administration funds, which were paid for by all city residents, were used to extend services, roads, water, sewage outward. So essentially, those who couldn't afford to leave the city were financially supporting those who did move out.
Which created the socioeconomic geography we often call the donut effect.
Precisely. The result was severe and often racially based segregation. The suburbs became segregated by income, race, and lifestyle, effectively isolating the core. The urban center became identified in the public consciousness with, poverty, crime, minorities, and deterioration, the hole in the donut. This contained mostly minorities versus the affluent, predominantly white ring. And this was definitely exacerbated by deliberate racial discrimination, lending practices, and real estate tactics like block busting.
The permanent distortion of wealth accumulation potential here is just staggering, and it relates directly to things like property taxes, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Because the ring captured the higher income, higher property value base, their local school systems and municipal services could rely on a pretty robust property tax income. Whereas the whole, the core city areas, was often left with a diminished tax base. They were reliant on property values that were depressed by the perceived social problems and, frankly, institutional neglect. This permanently distorted wealth accumulation opportunities. You had generations of residents in the urban core whose primary assets, their homes, simply could not appreciate at the same rate as those in the periphery, and their tax dollars bought fewer resources for their community. It's a vicious cycle.
We see the intensity of these urban challenges clearly in the history of regulatory attempts, like the attempts to address chronic housing shortages in New York City back in the early 1920s.
Yeah, that's a good example. In that case, NYC exempted new housing from taxes under the condition that rents did not exceed $9 per month per room. This was a massive incentive, actually. It led Metropolitan Life to build 54 five-story buildings. It was an attempt to use tax policy to control housing costs, which brings us to the ultimate risk: restrictive regulations turning assets into liabilities.
Exactly. Just look at the rent-controlled apartments in NYC in the late 1970s. Our sources mentioned something like 100,000 units were simply abandoned between 1975 and 1978. Why would that happen?
Well, because the restrictive regulations meant that the economic yield was so incredibly low that owners literally could not afford to maintain the buildings, let alone make any profit. The cost of essential repairs, like basic plumbing or heating, quickly surpassed the restricted rental income they were allowed to collect. When maintenance becomes impossible, the assets deteriorate, they drop below the slum line, and are ultimately just abandoned by discouraged owners. This really shows how crucial it is for any investor, whether you're in the city or the country, to understand that the regulatory environment is just as much a risk factor as market appreciation or interest rates.
That economic struggle managing restricted assets, that's actually the perfect transition point because it forces investors to define their core strategy, right? Are you chasing fast, quick transactional gains, or are you focused on residual long-term cash flow? And that strategic decision profoundly dictates whether you should focus on the high-cost, high-competition city or maybe the lower-cost, high-rehab country environment.
Okay, let's start with the transactional side: house flipping. This is focused almost entirely on appreciation, and it's fundamentally a game of speed. Speed to close is absolutely paramount to minimize the risk of a market drop between your purchase and your sale. It requires intense short-term expertise, primarily in things like construction, navigating permits, and marketing effectively.
Let's slow down the math just a bit here because this is where the capital crunch often happens for people. Say you find a distressed home in a rural or maybe a developing suburban area for $50,000 and you budget, let's say, $20,000 for a significant rehab. So now you have $70,000 invested.
Right. Now, typically, you'd use a high-interest hard money lender for that initial $70,000 because you need to speed the offer. They close fast. To get your money back out, you either need to sell the property quickly or you need to refinance into a traditional long-term loan. Now, if you want to hold the property, the bank will use the new, hopefully higher appraised value. Let's say it appraises for $100,000 after your rehab. But, and this is key, they will only lend you maybe 70% to 80% of that new value. That's the loan to value or LTV requirement.
Okay, so if the bank gives you a loan for 75% LTV on that $100,000 appraisal, they'll lend you $75,000. Your goal is to pay off the original $70,000 loan plus the hefty hard money interest. So if the appraisal comes in too low or maybe your rehab costs go over budget, you don't pull out all your capital. And that seems like the critical bottleneck for flippers. You only really succeed if you can create significant value rapidly, enough to justify that 75% LTV loan covering all your costs.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the residual deal, the buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat strategy, often called BRRRR. This treats real estate as more of a get-rich-slow play. It's focused on accumulating equity and cash flow over time. The key here isn't the quick sale. It's the ability to systematically create value, pull the capital back out via refinance, and then continuously trade up to larger, more profitable properties. This is the kind of strategy that, according to one source, took William Nickerson from just a $1,000 investment to millions in properties over about 16 years.
And that long-term hold offers a really significant advantage that flipping simply doesn't: the depreciation tax benefits. A flip is usually treated as ordinary income, which is taxed at high rates, but a rental held under the BRRR strategy generates depreciation.
That's the real wealth-building nugget right there. The entire property basis, which is the purchase price plus the cost of your improvements, is used for the depreciation calculation. So if you buy a rental for $80,000 and you add $15,000 in improvements, that $95,000 basis can be depreciated over 27.5 years for residential property. This lowers your taxable rental income every single year, often significantly offsetting the actual cash flow you receive.
And importantly, when you execute that refinance step of BRRR, the capital you pull out, that money is generally tax-free, isn't it?
Absolutely, because it's considered debt, it's a loan, it's not income. You are essentially realizing the equity you've created in a tax-advantaged way. This is fundamentally why long-term rental holding is often considered the bedrock of serious real estate wealth. Hashtag tag 2.2, navigating costs and property management.
Okay, so when you enter the game, particularly with the BRRR flipping strategy, which are common in less dense environments, you immediately confront the beast of rehab costs. They're almost always the biggest expense and probably the most common source of profit destruction.
You have to approach rehab costs with rigorous discipline, no question. The single best way to save money and mitigate risk is by finding and retaining contractors who value repeat business. That relationship is key. Their ongoing relationship with you is worth more than trying to squeeze every penny out of a one-time inflated bid. Furthermore, you really cannot rely on simple per square foot estimates unless you are highly experienced and dealing with a very specific, repeatable house type, like maybe tract housing.
So detail estimating requires a much more granular component-by-component breakdown, exterior, interior, general systems, things like that. Why is that level of detail so necessary?
Because of the wild cards, particularly the foundation. Foundation repairs are the ultimate variable expense. They can run from just a few $100s to address maybe some simple drainage issues, all the way up to tens of thousands of dollars for major structural fixes involving pier and beam replacement or stabilization. In rare, really bad cases, if the earth beneath the structure is shifting radically, the repair might actually be economically infeasible. You might have to walk away. So you must, without exception, consult a qualified structural engineer for specialized advice before you commit to a deal that requires significant foundational work. Ignoring this is just financial suicide.
Wow. Okay. So once the rehab is finally done, you transition into the landlord challenge. And this seems heavily influenced by your environment too. Whether you're in the city or country, successful property management seems to require a customer-oriented, constant improvement attitude. You're essentially a service provider, not just a collector of checks, right?
That service mentality is absolutely key. And it's especially challenged in high-density urban settings when you're dealing with low-income rental markets. We saw studies, for example, in Milwaukee, which showed a significant rent premium being charged to voucher holders, estimated at maybe $55 to $70 higher per month than comparable unassisted renters. But what's crucial to understand is that despite paying more, those voucher holders often reported more housing problems.
That's a really profound finding. It suggests that the financial premium isn't necessarily buying better housing stock or better service, but perhaps compensating the landlord for the complexity, the regulation, and the perceived risk associated with that specific market segment. It really underscores the difficulty of generating stable residual income in highly regulated, high-need urban housing segments.
And finally, let's not forget that investors rely heavily on real estate agents, but their roles are not all the same. An agent specializing in listings, meaning representing sellers, generally offers much broader marketing opportunities and lead generation potential, mainly because they control the inventory. A buyer's agent, while obviously essential for acquisitions, doesn't typically generate the same scale of business opportunities for themselves or their network.
So the goal for an investor is often to find a great listing agent who can also act as a sort of wise counselor through the transaction.
Absolutely. The very best agents possess profound objectivity. When transactions get emotional, buyers panic, the seller is frustrated, the market is shifting rapidly, the agent's ability to stand back and view the situation dispassionately. Focusing only on the objective financial outcome, that's what their clients are truly paying for. If the agent gets sucked into the emotional drama, their advice becomes unreliable. Fast. This brings up a really important question. Real estate success, whether you're doing a high-leverage urban flip or a long-term rural BRRR deal, depends entirely on defining and managing risk effectively. So how do we measure risk when applying capital to these diverse, often volatile environments?
Well, investment risk at its core is simply the chance that your expected returns from securities or property values will fail to materialize. Specifically, that prices will fall. Burton Malkiel noted famously that beating the market isn't generally about superior clairvoyance. It's usually about accepting greater risk for which you hope to be compensated.
And that risk, as we learned so painfully during the subprime crisis, can be masterfully disguised by financial engineering. We really have to dive a bit deeper into the catastrophe documented in Michael Lewis's The Big Short. These complicated instruments, collateralized debt obligations or CDOs, and credit default swaps, were basically used to lend money to people who, statistically, had very little chance of repaying.
Can you explain the central deception there? Why did huge global institutions keep buying these increasingly toxic assets, genuinely believing they are safe?
Because the structure itself masked the homogeneity of the underlying risk. It was clever, in a disastrous way. The CDOs were sliced into different tranches. You had the risky triple B slices, the supposedly safer single A slices, and then the supposedly ironclad double A slices. The market believed the rating agencies who stamped these ratings on them. Here's the punchline. The market charged 4 times less to insure via credit default swaps, the supposedly safe double A slice, than they did the openly risky triple B slice, even though both were effectively bets against the exact same pool of underlying risky subprime mortgage bonds.
Wow. So it's like if you were insuring against a 100-car pileup on the highway, they sold you one insurance policy that said this specific car is safe and another that said this other car is risky, but they were both inevitably going to be in the same pileup, and you paid drastically different premiums based purely on the label.
Precisely. The complicated structure allowed the market to suspend disbelief and essentially believe that by slicing up garbage, they could magically create gold. The deception wasn't necessarily a sudden collapse. It was the engineered belief that complex financial instruments could somehow eliminate fundamental underlying risk, which of course they couldn't. Hashtag tag tag 3.2, leveraging debt and capital.
Okay, so investors have to operate within this reality, recognizing that financial models can and do fail spectacularly. So if we are using debt wisely strategically to boost returns, not drain them, what specialized tools apply specifically to our urban versus rural investors?
Well, the transactional flipper, often working on those rural or distressed single-family homes we talked about, relies heavily on hard money loans. They are fast, they're flexible, they require minimal documentation compared to banks, making them perfect for those speed-to-close requirements. However, and it's a big however, their high interest rates, sometimes well into double digits, demand extremely short repayment periods, usually 3 to 12 months. Otherwise, the interest costs just consume the entire potential profit margin.
Okay, contrast that with the ultimate flexibility of private loans.
Right. Private loans are simply term loans arranged directly between two private entities or individuals. Could be family, friends, a wealthy colleague, another investor. Their structure, repayment terms, interest rate, it's all entirely negotiable between the parties. They offer flexibility that no institutional lender can possibly match, often requiring only the property itself as collateral.
And then as the investor scales up, particularly maybe into the multifamily residential space or small commercial properties common in denser suburban or urban areas, they inevitably hit the conventional loan limit. Currently, that's 10 finance properties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At that point, if you want to keep growing using leverage, you generally need a portfolio loan. These are typically offered by institutions like credit unions or savings and loans, sometimes smaller community banks. The crucial difference is that the lender keeps the loan in portfolio, meaning they do not sell it on the secondary market to giants like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. Because the lender retains the entire risk themselves, they compensate by offering somewhat less favorable terms to the borrower. That often means things like adjustable rates instead of fixed, slightly higher interest rates, and stricter ongoing reporting requirements. Hashtag tag tag 3.3 lender underwriting and tax strategies.
Okay, so lenders, especially when dealing with those riskier portfolio loans they keep on their own books, rely on rigorous underwriting to protect themselves. For investors navigating this world, what are the primary financial metrics they absolutely have to hit?
The two absolute core metrics are the debt service coverage ratio, or DSCR, and loan-to-value LTV. The DSCR must typically be a minimum of 1.25 to 1. What that means in practical terms is, for every dollar you owe in annual debt service, that's principal and interest payments, your property's net operating income, or NOI, must generate at least $1.25.
Why the $1.25's cushion? What's that for?
That 25% cushion is essentially the lender's protection against unforeseen issues. Things like cyclical vacancies, unexpected major maintenance expenses, rising property taxes, or insurance. If you only made exactly $1 in income for every $1 owed in debt, any single unexpected expense would put you immediately into default territory. That cushion is non-negotiable risk management for them. Secondly, the loan-to-value, LTV, on the overall portfolio usually cannot exceed 75%, meaning the lender never wants their total debt exposure to represent more than 3/4 of the underlying asset's current market value. And finally, a credit score minimum of 680 is pretty standard these days, and you should be prepared to provide detailed, written explanations for any 30-day late payments on your credit report.
Got it. Beyond just securing the financing, smart wealth building demands almost daily attention to tax strategy, not just, annual panic come tax time.
Oh, absolutely. That proactive approach is critical. For instance, you should be meticulously tracking and documenting all those ordinary and necessary business expenses. Things like office supplies, mileage tracking, portions of utility costs. They add up, but they're easily missed. More importantly, you really need to talk to your tax advisor before you initiate a major transaction, like a property sale. This ensures you can maximize the advantages of deferring capital gains, maybe through instruments like 1031 exchanges, if applicable. Or, conversely, maximizing loss realization if the property sale is unfortunately unfavorable. Acting after the fact is often way too late to structure things optimally.
We mentioned the significant depreciation benefits of long-term rentals earlier. Are there specific tax advantages related to the rising popularity of short-term rentals, often found in those unique rural or leisure destination environments?
Yes, and this is actually a significant advantage for many investors. Short-term rentals, think Airbnbs, VRBOs, often receive the same beneficial depreciation tax treatment as long-term rentals, but they typically come with dramatically higher cash flow potential per unit. Crucially, they generally do not fall into the complex active business category for tax purposes, which can trigger additional self-employment taxes, unlike certain other small business ventures. That's provided the investor follows specific rules regarding personal usage and management involvement, of course.
Okay. And finally, just a reminder that the capital for real estate investment isn't limited solely to your regular taxable bank accounts.
Absolutely not. Almost anyone eligible for a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA, or even small business owners with employer-sponsored plans like a SEP IRA or a solo 401k, can usually open a self-directed version of that same account. This allows you to invest your retirement funds directly into real estate assets like rental properties or even private loans secured by real estate. This is a massive opportunity because the gains can grow tax-deferred or potentially tax-free, depending on the account type, Roth versus traditional. And this applies regardless of your age, although contribution limits and rules around required minimum distributions still apply after age 70 and a half for traditional accounts.
Okay, let's shift the conversation now. Away from spreadsheets and zoning codes, back to psychology. If you choose an environment, say the relentless pace and density of the city versus the predictable calm and space of the country, how does that physical location actually impact your ability to execute your goals and build the required discipline for success?
Okay, let's unpack this. The psychology of execution. The overwhelming finding in behavioral science is pretty clear. Environment often matters more than sheer motivation when it comes to forming habits. We are, as humans, constantly seeking the path of least resistance. Our surroundings shape our behavior profoundly.
So if I were to move from, say, a high-stress city apartment where it's noisy, cramped, maybe preventing me from waking up early to work on my key projects, and I move to a quiet rural home with dedicated space, am I effectively giving myself a giant advantage in terms of execution?
Precisely. You are essentially giving yourself a clean slate, behaviorally speaking. Habits become associated not just with a single trigger, but with the entire context surrounding the behavior. That includes your location, the specific room you're in, the view out the window, even your daily commute route. When you move to a genuinely new environment, you're not constantly fighting hundreds of ingrained old cues that might lead to distraction or procrastination. It's significantly easier to build new productive habits because you haven't yet linked that new desk or that new morning view to old negative routines.
That makes sense. That stable, supportive environment is where habits can form more easily. But once we settle in, whether we choose the city or the country, we still need that internal drive, don't we? The successful investor, our sources suggest, must actively visualize their goals and dreams.
Visualization is paramount, yes, but it needs to be detailed and, importantly, felt. It's not enough to just vaguely say, I want to be rich. You need to vividly visualize your specific goals and dreams, and then allow yourself to intensely experience the feelings associated with achieving them as if they're happening now. So if you're visualizing buying that 10-unit apartment building in the city, you need to almost feel the stress of the closing process and the immense relief and satisfaction of collecting those first month's rents. This intense feeling-based visualization helps program your subconscious mind for success. It makes the possibility of achievement feel tangible and real, not just a distant wish. Hashtag 4.2, discipline and focus in the pursuit of goals.
But visualization and even a clean, supportive environment won't actually execute the work for you. That requires discipline, doesn't it? And discipline is often painful in the moment.
We really have to internalize this fundamental truth. The pain of discipline is felt immediately, yes, but that pain transforms over time into desire, into capability, into strength. Conversely, the pain of regret, of not doing what you committed to, can linger forever. So many people fail because they wait until they feel like doing the critical activity. That's a trap. The core commitment must be to act on your commitments regardless of your momentary feelings or mood. If you promised yourself you will call 3 difficult contractors today to get bids, you do it even if you'd much rather just answer easy emails.
That brings us squarely to time management. Most of us tend to operate on an annual calendar, thinking in terms of yearly goals. But ironically, our sources suggest this actually sabotages our performance.
Yeah, that annualized thinking, the idea that you have a full 12 months to hit a goal, is a major productivity killer, precisely because it promotes delay. It's too long a time frame. We naturally push things off until Q3 or Q4. I've got time. Performance is maximized by focusing on much shorter cycles, like the concept presented in the book, The 12-Week Year.
Yeah.
You break down your big annual goals into a detailed, written weekly plan derived from concrete 12-week objectives.
And the beauty of that shorter 12-week cycle is that it forces almost daily accountability, doesn't it? You really can't afford to miss a crucial Monday morning task when you know you only have 12 weeks total to hit a major benchmark.
Exactly. And that tight structure faces you to perform a critical productivity check on yourself constantly. We often confuse sheer busyness with actual productivity. Being busy, like constantly answering emails, filing paperwork, doing administrative tasks, can easily account for 80% of your time. But those activities often move the needle very little towards your major goals.
So the productive person must identify that critical 20%, the high leverage activities that drive results.
They must focus ruthlessly on those keystone activities. For a real estate investor, that might be things like analyzing new potential deals, calling potential private money lenders, meeting face-to-face with key contractors or partners. By ensuring that your time is disproportionately dedicated to that vital 20% that accounts for the vast majority of your results, you leverage the power of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, and you ensure you are consistently moving toward your wealth goals rather than just getting lost in the daily administrative churn. This kind of discipline is absolutely essential whether you're managing high-volume city tenants or coordinating contractors for a rural flip that might be hundreds of miles away. #tag outro. So if we try to connect all these threads back to the bigger picture, what does this synthesis of architecture, urban theory, finance, and even behavior mean for you, the listener, trying to choose your ideal environment for building wealth and, just as importantly, living a great life?
Well, it seems the choice between urban density and rural space is fundamentally a choice of economic ecosystem. It's really not just about which view you prefer out your window, though aesthetics are subjective and important to quality of life. The dense city core offers truly unparalleled financial opportunity in some ways. Potentially higher yields, access to specialized investment niches, rapid access to capital, and those powerful network effects that concentrate high-skilled labor and
Right.
ideas.
But that urban opportunity demands navigating immensely high costs, intense regulatory complexity, as we saw with rent control, significant social challenges, and absolutely brutal market competition. The country or the deep suburbs, conversely, offer physical space, generally lower initial entry costs for property, and an environment perhaps more conducive to systematic long-term appreciation plays like BRRR and flipping, where rehab skills are key. However, success out there requires real mastery of construction, developing deep rehab systems, and effective property management, often executed over long distances.
We established earlier that the historical shift that drove much of the middle class to the suburbs was economically skewed. It was effectively subsidized by urban residents who stayed behind, and it resulted in highly segregated environments, which permanently distorted generational wealth accumulation patterns. But that historic incentive structure seems to be rapidly dissolving, or at least changing.
It really does. The rapid advance of prop tech, digital tools like building information modeling, BIM, for construction, vast data repositories like LoopNet for commercial asset tracking, and the widespread normalization of remote work is fundamentally altering the geography of opportunity. If a significant portion of the middle class no longer needs to physically commute to the city center to earn a high wage, the entire economic model of the city is profoundly challenged. This leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. Given that technology is steadily eroding the necessity of being physically present for many high-value jobs, how will prop tech and the continuation of remote work trends alter the economic incentive structure that originally drove middle-class families to the periphery? And perhaps more importantly, what specific, vital, and non-virtual necessity must the city core offer in, say, 2030 and beyond to maintain its indispensability as a center of wealth creation and human connection?